Hey everyone, welcome back to this explainer. Today, we are diving into a really fascinating shift in Australian political mechanics. We're going to do a completely objective, data-driven breakdown of a recent 4BC Brisbane broadcast to figure out exactly why One Nation's support is growing so rapidly. We're looking purely at the polling data, the underlying voter psychology, and, the structural realities of the upcoming federal election. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's a quick look at how we're going to break it all down. First up, the three-horse race. Then, we'll look at a concept called flipping the bird. After that, we'll explore the idea of being awkward but authentic. Then, we'll crunch the math of preference flows. And finally, we'll wrap up with momentum, candidates, and policies. All right, starting with part one, the three-horse race. Let's look at the current polling landscape. 30%. Seriously? Let that number sink in for a second. According to the broadcast's breakdown of the absolute latest news poll, One Nation has actually surged back to hit 30 points in primary vote support. I mean, this is massive. It places them on unexpectedly even footing with the governing Labour Party, at least in a primary vote context. The commentators over at 4BC were genuinely struck by this resilience, noting that their vote is holding up remarkably well. So when you look at the broader landscape here, you've got One Nation at 30 points, Labour at 30 points, and the coalition lagging significantly behind. They're showing some signs of life, sure, but they're still sitting somewhere around 17 to 19%. Because of this specific data, political commentators on the broadcast are now openly declaring that the next federal election is shaping up to be a genuine three-horse race. The traditional two-party dominance that we're so used to, it's being mathematically challenged right before our eyes. Which brings us to part two, flipping the bird, and what this tells us about voter sentiment. The 4BC commentators noted something super interesting. They said, quote, "People are actually busting to get the chance to do it, to flip the bird, so to speak, at the two major parties." The analysis here is that a huge chunk of these voters aren't necessarily your long-term rusted-on One Nation loyalists. Actually, a lot of them might be lifelong Labour or Liberal voters. But right now, they want to send a highly defiant message. Giving Pauline Hanson a go is literally their way of registering deep, systemic dissatisfaction with the major political establishment. It's wild. All right, moving on to part three, awkward but authentic. We're looking at a pretty fascinating PR case study here. So, during a recent parliamentary break, Pauline Hanson took a European trip. Specifically, she hit up a UK conservative conference and then went to a high-end Dolce & Gabbana fashion event in Sicily. Now, stop and think about that. In the middle of a massive national cost of living crisis where everyday people are really struggling to pay bills, a politician hobnobbing overseas is traditionally a massive PR disaster. Like, it's the exact kind of optic that usually ruins a political campaign overnight. And this brilliantly illustrates the current political phenomenon we're seeing. Normally, you would expect massive public backlash over a politician attending a high-end fashion event overseas, but instead, there was actually forgiveness from the voting public. So why? Well, because Hanson openly admitted it. She bluntly said the event wasn't really her cup of tea. And crucially, she made it unequivocally clear she was paying on her own dime. She wasn't using a single cent of taxpayer money. By just not hiding it, and definitely not charging the public purse, she entirely short-circuited the usual political outrage cycle. The commentators summed up this PR phenomenon perfectly, calling it, quote, awkward but authentic. That's what she is. Voters right now seem highly, highly forgiving of actions that aren't hidden from them or funded by their taxes. It's really not about being perfectly polished or media-trained anymore. It's about being perceived as genuine, even if the optics are, a bit clumsy. That raw authenticity is cutting right through the usual political spin, endearing her to voters who are just flat out tired of typical political behavior. Let's shift gears to part four, the math of preference flows, or how you can actually win without hitting 40%. Okay, so when primary support is heavily fractured, like we're seeing right now in this new three-horse race, preference flows become the absolute essential mechanism for forming a government. This is the systemic transfer of votes from minor candidates to major ones, and it changes the entire game. As the 4BC federal political editor pointed out, whoever wants to form the next government is going to heavily rely on these exact preference flows to get their candidates over the finish line. So the crucial point is this. Conventional political wisdom used to dictate that a party needed a primary vote of at least 40% to win an election in their own right. But look at the current reality. The Labour Party right now holds 94 seats in the lower house with a primary vote of only around 32 to 34%. To put that into perspective, majorities can absolutely be built on primary votes in the low 30s, thanks entirely to the systemic distribution of preferences. That means one nation's 30% is a mathematically viable foundation for gaining some serious political leverage. And finally, Part 5, Momentum, Candidates, and Policies. Let's look at the hurdles ahead. While the polling numbers are incredibly strong right now, the broadcast did highlight some massive strategic hurdles. First up, missing policy details. While one nation's stances on major issues like immigration, climate change, and welfare are super well known to the public, the 4BC analysis stressed a glaring gap. They desperately need to articulate detailed platforms and, crucially, explain their funding strategies for core governance areas like health, education, and defense. Because relying on a few lightning rod issues just won't be enough as the actual campaign draws closer and voters demand comprehensive plans. Then there is the massive logistical challenge on the ground. Think about it. Strong polling numbers are entirely useless if you don't actually have credible names on a ballot paper. As the commentators outlined, one nation has a critical three-step process ahead of them. First, they have to find willing candidates. Second, they have to rigorously vet those candidates to avoid any disastrous campaign blow-ups. And third, they need to strategically place them in winnable seats. You can't just run people anywhere. You have to target specific electorates where that primary vote can actually convert into a victory. All of this brings us to what the broadcaster rightfully called the million-dollar question. Can they keep the momentum up? We are still roughly 14 to 15 months out from an election. Can a 12-month polling surge built on anti-establishment sentiment and raw authenticity survive the intense microscopic scrutiny, the required policy rollouts, and the grueling logistics of a full federal campaign? I really want to leave you with that provocative thought to ponder. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope it brought some incredible clarity to the political mechanics at play here. As always, keep learning.